Welcome. You're about to drift, not plunge, but gently drift into a world worn smooth by centuries of wind and brine. Tonight, we leave behind the light of the modern world, the glow of screens and hum of machines, and instead descend into an older, quieter rhythm, one carved not into circuits, but into the bone, one whispered on the tides. We journey now to the Bronze Age, a time when land was still wild, and the sea was not just scenery, but sustenance, punishment, and mystery. This isn't the heroic sea of Homeric epics or gilded myths. No winged sandals, no tridents, no painted ships with lion-prow bows. No, this is the low tide of history, thick with salt and soot, the forgotten daily life of coastal dwellers who survived not with glory, but with grinding persistence. People whose names have been washed away, but whose footprints remain fossilized in ancient sandbanks. Let yourself sink into it. Let the breath of the past fill your lungs, slow and cold and steady. Breathe. Picture a coastline not yet charted, the sky low with fog, rocks slick with lichen, a wind off the sea that cuts through the thickest wool. Picture a child's first breath, smelling not of flowers or firewood, but fish. The raw, sour temps of drying herring and burning seaweed. Imagine your world no wider than the cove you fish, and no more certain than the next tide. Imagine knowing the rhythms of wind and gulls better than the patterns of your own thoughts. Let your shoulders drop, let your breath slow. With each exhale, drift deeper into this world. A world that never waits, never rests, and never forgives. Imagine yourself standing hip deep in a slate-gray sea, the water cold enough to steal your breath. Morning mist veils the horizon, blending the sky and sea into one endless sheet of silver. The sun is a dull blur above the tree line, not yet strong enough to warm your skin. Your clothes, woven from sheep's wool thick as bark, cling to you like wet moss. They smell of smoke and sweat and sea. Everything does. Your stomach gnaws quietly. You haven't eaten since a thin soup last night, a few scraps of smoked eel, barley, and the bitter greens your cousin gathered from a marsh. Hunger is familiar, like a dull stone in your belly. You've learned to carry it like a second spine. It hums quietly in the background of every task, every breath. The net in your hands is rough and wet, its cords biting into your palms. It's hand-twisted from plant fibers, flax maybe, or stinging nettle, boiled and pounded and spun into strands by the hands of your grandmother. Every knot remembers the fingers that tied it. Every patch tells a story of failure and repair. It's a heavy thing, soaked with salt and age. As you pull, the cold seeps in through your skin, into the meat of your fingers, and settles deep into your bones like silt in a harbor. You can feel it dull your grip, your senses, your very thoughts. Others stand beside you, cousins, neighbors, quiet silhouettes, blurred by fog. No one speaks much. Words are saved for later, for fireside, talk, and barter. Now, you work. You move with the rhythm of generations. Dip, pull, twist, lift. The rhythm is all that matters. It has its own memory, older than any spoken tale. Fish are scarce. Always scarce. The sea is generous only in its unpredictability. Some mornings, your basket brims with wriggling silver. Most mornings, it doesn't. Today, maybe you'll catch 4, maybe none. But you rise anyway. The tide doesn't care for your luck. The wind does not pause for hope. You feel a tug, small but promising. A darting movement in the net. The line vibrates, and with effort, you haul it upward. A fish, thin, long, with eyes like polished stones. Not much meat, but it's something. You slip it into a woven basket strapped to your waist and return to your rhythm. Again and again. Even when you return home, soaked and sore, the labor does not end. There are nets to rinse and stretch across driftwood frames, fish to clean with slivers of bronze or obsidian, your hands red and raw. Smokehouses, 2 10-stone huts where fires burn low and wet, fed with seaweed and dung, their ceilings blackened with years of grease. Salt to rub in, carefully, sparingly, as if blessing the fish before it vanishes into a winter meal. Salt is sacred. Salt is wealth. It comes not from mines, but from tide pools and long afternoons, watching the water recede, leaving behind crusts of white like the memory of a wave. You gather it grain by grain, storing it in clay jars sealed with wax and hope. Some days, you dream of finding a vein of salt, richer than all others, enough to trade for tools, or barley, or a bit of soft linen for your youngest. Your home is a low, turf-covered dwelling. Inside, smoke drifts in lazy spirals from the central hearth, never quite finding the hole in the roof meant to release it. Everything smells of the fire: your clothes, your hair, your breath. It lingers on your skin like a second scent. You barely notice anymore. The walls are dark, the light golden and flickering, and the roof sighs with the weight of damp moss. At night, you sit by the fire and sew nets or carve tools. The old ones tell stories about great storms, about fish as long as boats, about islands that drift and vanish. Children listen, wide-eyed, until sleep folds them into silence. You listen too, your hands busy, your eyes half closed, your body still swaying slightly with the remembered rhythm of the waves. The words curl around your thoughts like smoke. Outside, the tide rises. It always does. You lie on your mat of straw and sealskin, and you dream of green fire in the sky, of whales with eyes like men, of the sea parting to reveal a city of stone and bone beneath, of your boat, smaller than a gull, riding waves the size of mountains. You dream not because you wish to escape, but because even in dreams, the sea follows. And still, you rise. Tomorrow will come again, with or without fish, with or without warmth, with or without you. This is not a tale of triumph. It is a tale of a life built not on conquest, but on repetition. A life where survival is not dramatic, it's daily, quiet, constant, salted, smoked, told in layers of labor and the whisper of waves, in the silent pact between tide and toil. Let that thought carry you gently into the deeper waters of history. Now, let the tide of time carry us onward gently, steadily. We leave behind the coastal toil of the fisherman and drift instead into the broader sweep of the sea itself. A sea not of daily nets and aching hands, but of questions, of maps without margins, of stars that do not merely decorate the sky, but pull the brave forward, always north, always further. Our next companion is a man who did not fish, but listened to those who did not seek conquest, but knowledge. His name was Pytheas. Pytheas of Massaia, a Greek city nestled along the Mediterranean's northern edge, modern Marseille, a place where wine and oil, salt and fish were loaded onto creaking ships under a sky always humming with gulls. A city of traders, poets, priests, and seafarers. Pytheas was among them, but also apart. He was a thinker, a patient observer, a quiet revolutionary in sandals and wool, with a measuring rod and curiosity sharper than any sword. Around 325 BCE, when most Greeks still believed that the known world curled in on itself like a shell, Pytheas looked outward to the mists beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where maps ended in dragons and the sea was set to boil, where sailors returned speaking of days without night and beasts that bellowed through white fog. It was there he sailed, not as a conqueror, but as a question. We do not know the name of his ship. We do not know the names of his crew. They are lost. like so many voices swallowed by the sea. But we know he carried with him tools of strange simplicity: a nomana stick to measure the sun as height, a sharp eye for tides and angles, and a willingness to believe that the world was far larger than any scroll had yet shown. He sailed north, hugging unfamiliar coasts, past Iberian cliffs and Gallic rivers, past the green hills of what we now call Brittany, past Cornwall's craggy jaws, into the unknown waters of the North Atlantic, where waves do not roll, they loom, where fog wraps around the ship like old cloth, where stars spin differently, where stories grow cold. Pytheas listened. He spoke with local tribes, likely through gestures and borrowed words, learning of their ways. He recorded their customs, their diets: milk and mead, smoked fish and barley. He described how they farmed in furrows cut into wet peat, how they built circular homes with sod roofs, and let smoke drift through thatch. He watched the moon and saw how the tides moved with it. No one before him had written that down. He watched the midnight sun and realized he had passed into a realm where day and night no longer kept their proper places. And he found a land he called Thule. No one can quite agree where Thule was. It might have been Norway, or Iceland, or a memory passed to him by others, a tale whispered at a smoky fire about a place further still, where the sea turns to glass and mist. He described a strange, gelatinous ocean-likely drift, ice or slushy meltwater so thick it could not be sailed. And there, at the far edge of the world, he turned back. He had mapped something most feared to even name. When Pytheas returned, he wrote his findings in a book now lost to time. It was called On the Ocean. None of his words remain, not directly, only quotations, fragments, scattered mentions by later writers, many of whom scoffed at him. Strabo, a respected geographer, called his claims absurd. Polybius dismissed them. They thought he lied, or exaggerated, or dreamed too far. His seas were too cold, his lands too strange, his methods too simple to be believed. And yet, he was right. The sea does follow the moon. The sun does stay in the sky in northern summers. The people of those misted coasts did live on dairy and grain, on fish and stories, as he said. Modern science, with satellites and sonar, now confirms what Pytheas saw with bare eyes and ancient tools. He was not just he was a scientist, centuries ahead of his time. But because his journey did not end in gold or conquest, his name faded. Because he brought back truth instead of trophies, he was left off the lists of great men. And yet, there he is, still sailing in the background of history, like a faint silhouette on a foggy horizon. Imagine him now, alone on the deck of a creaking boat, wrapped in layers of wool, his hands ink-stained, his breath rising in clouds. The sea murmurs below. He holds the gnomon steady at dawn, watching the sun crest low above the northern sky. Around him, the crew mutters about strange lights. But Pytheas listens to the sea, to the sky, to the slow truth of the world. He does not seek to dominate, he seeks to know. And in this quiet, humble seeking, he leaves behind something greater than gold, a way to see. So rest now, and let Pytheas drift beside you. A ghost on the wind, a mind that dared to follow the moon. His journey is not over, it continues every time we look at a map, every time we watch the tide, every time we wonder what lies just beyond the fog. Now, let the tide of time carry us onward gently, steadily. We leave behind the coastal toil of the fisherman and drift instead into the broader sweep of the sea itself. A sea not of daily nets and aching hands, but of questions, of maps without margins, of stars that do not merely decorate the sky, but pull the brave forward, always north, always further. Our next companion is a man who did not fish, but listened to those who did not seek conquest, but knowledge. His name was Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek city nestled along the Mediterranean's northern edge, a place where wine and oil, salt and fish were loaded onto creaking ships under a sky always humming with gulls. A city of traders, poets, priests, and seers. Pytheas was among them, but also apart. He was a thinker, a patient observer, a quiet revolutionary in sandals and wool, with a measuring rod and curiosity sharper than any sword. Around 325 BCE, when most Greeks still believed that the known world curled in on itself like a shell, Pytheas looked outward to the mists beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the great straits we now call Gibraltar, where maps ended in dragons and the sea was said to boil, where sailors returned speaking of days without night and beasts that bellowed through white fog. It was there he sailed, not as a conqueror, but as a question. We do not know the name of his ship. We do not know the names of his crew. They are lost, like so many voices swallowed by the sea. But we know he carried with him tools of strange simplicity. A gnome on a stick to measure the sun as height, a sharp eye for tides and angles, and a willingness to believe that the world was far larger than any scroll had yet shown. He sailed north, hugging unfamiliar coasts, past Iberian cliffs and Gallic rivers, past the green hills of what we now call Brittany, past Cornwall's craggy jaws, into the unknown waters of the North Atlantic, where waves do not roll, they loom, where fog wraps around the ship like old cloth, where stars spin differently, where stories grow cold. Pytheas listened. He spoke with local tribes, likely through gestures and borrowed words, learning of their ways. He recorded their customs, their diets, milk and mead, smoked fish and barley. He described how they farmed in furrows cut into wet peat, how they built circular homes with sod roofs and let smoke drift through thatch. He watched the moon and saw how the tides moved with it. No one before him had written that down. He watched the midnight sun and realized he had passed into a realm where day and night no longer kept their proper places. And he found a land he called Thule. No one can quite agree where Thule was. It might have been Norway, or Iceland, or a memory passed to him by others, a tale whispered at a smoky fire about a place further still, where the sea turns to glass and mist. He described a strange gelatinous ocean, likely drift ice or slushy meltwater so thick it could not be sailed. And there, at the far edge of the world, he turned back. He had mapped something most feared to even name. When Pytheas returned, he wrote his findings in a book now lost to time. It was called On the Ocean. None of his words remain, not directly, only quotations. Fragments, scattered mentions by later writers, many of whom scoffed at him. Strabo, a respected geographer, called his claims absurd. Polybius dismissed them. They thought he lied, or exaggerated, or dreamed too far. His seas were too cold, his lands too strange, his methods too simple to be believed. And yet, he was right. The sea does follow the moon. The sun does stay in the sky in northern summers. The people of those misted coasts did live on dairy and grain, on fish and stories, as he said. Modern science, with satellites and sonar, now confirms what Pytheas saw with bare eyes and ancient tools. He was not just he was a scientist, centuries ahead of his time. But because his journey did not end in gold or conquest, his name faded. Because he brought back truth instead of trophies, he was left off the lists of great men. And yet, there he is, still sailing in the background of history, like a faint silhouette on a foggy horizon. Imagine him now, alone on the deck of a creaking boat, wrapped in layers of wool, his hands ink-stained, his breath rising in clouds. Stars glint above. The sea murmurs below. He holds the gnomon steady at dawn, watching the sun crest low above the northern sky. Around him, the crew mutters about strange lights. But Pytheas listens to the sea, to the sky, to the slow truth of the world. He does not seek to dominate. He seeks to know. And in this quiet, humble seeking, he leaves behind something greater than gold, a way to see. So rest now, and let Pytheas drift beside you. A ghost on the wind. A mind that dared to follow the moon. His journey is not over, it continues. Every time we look at a map. Every time we watch the tide. Every time we wonder what lies just beyond the fog. Now, the water deepens. We follow the fading wake of Pytheas, not across the waves but beneath them. Down where the sun turns to shadow. Where silence reigns. Where forgotten halls rest in cold silt, and barnacles crust the memories of drowned men. This is not the sea of sailing. This is the sea of secrets. The Bronze Age, for all its shimmering name, was an era defined as much by absence as by artifact. Its peoples left no great books, no pyramids, or vast temples etched with their stories. But they left ships, or rather fragments of them. Timber ribs, buried in sand, cargoes frozen mid anchors without ropes. And it is through shipwrecks we glimpse the world they built and the lives they lost. Imagine, for a moment, a ship slipping out of a quiet cove, its hull creaking under the weight of tinning, amphorae of oil, maybe dried figs, maybe salted fish packed tightly in resin-lined jars. There are no sails as we know them, just hide stitched over frames, catching a cautious breeze. Oars dip rhythmically. The coast fades. Now, imagine that ship never arrives. In 1982, divers stumbled upon an amazing find off southern Turkey's coast. A Bronze Age shipwreck over 3,300 years old. It lay 45 meters deep, and it changed what we thought we knew. The vessel, though long decayed, still bore a cargo of wondrous copper ingots, stacked like loaves of bread, tin from far-off mines, Canaanite jars filled with resin, Egyptian scarabs, Baltic, Amba, Mycenaean pottery, and even ivory from Africa. It was, quite literally, a floating marketplace. And then, silence. The ship sank. No one came to rescue. No record was written. No lament soon. It simply vanished beneath the waves, its crew swallowed, its mission forgotten until divers stumbled upon it millennia later. These wrecks, silent as they are, speak in layers. They tell us that trade in the Bronze Age was vast, complex, and deeply interconnected. That tin from Cornwall might end up in the hands of a blacksmith in Syria. That olive oil from Crete might be poured into a cup in Cyprus. These were not isolated coastal villages, they were part of a maritime web, bound together by sail and storm. Sometimes, archaeologists find more than cargo. In a wreck near Cape Gelidonia, also in Turkey. Divers uncovered the belongings of a bronze smith tools, raw metal, personal items. Not a rich merchant, but a tradesman plying his craft across the waves. Was he heading to a port to sell his work? Was he fleeing war? Was he simply traveling home? We will never know. What we do know is that the sea preserves, it takes, but it also keeps. In these still, dark places where light does not reach, wood lasts. Metal resists rust. Even textiles sometimes survive mere traces, but enough. Enough to tell a story of storm and trade, of routes long gone, of sailors whose names are lost but whose cargo still whispers. And then there are the wrecks we have not yet found. Somewhere, beneath the silt and current, there may lie a boat filled with fishhooks and nets, or one bearing gifts for a distant king, or the remains of a vessel dashed against rocks in a sudden gale. its decks scattered with the sandals of young men. Some ships will never be found. They disintegrated long ago. But even in their absence, they shape our view of the past. Because every sunken ship was once a journey, a risk taken, a hope. And when we find their remains, we do not just recover objects, we recover intentions. Someone once loaded that cargo, planned that route, kissed someone goodbye, and the sea, indifferent as ever, took it all. So now, imagine drifting down, deep beneath the waves, past layers of history, past broken jars and half-buried timbers. You find yourself beside a excellent, intact, untouched. The water is still, the cargo untouched. You hear nothing but your own breath and the slow creak of memory. A ship, a story, a silence. Now, let us rise again slowly, gently from the sunken silence of the seafloor. The water clears, the sky returns, the wind picks up, warm and dry now, brushing against olive trees and wind-worn stones. We are no longer with the weary hands of fishermen or the brave navigators of lost routes. We are climbing inland, past sunburned fields and terraced hillsides, through winding paths that echo with the soft clink of sandals on stone. We ascend toward sun-drenched plateaus and palace complexes, where the air smells not of salt, but of incense, honeyed wine, roasted grain, and baked earth. Here, the fish is not bait or barter, not sustenance drawn from desperation, but a treasure, a statement, a symbol, a delicacy carefully chosen, thoughtfully prepared, and deeply savored. In the world of the Bronze Age elite, wealth did not always glitter in gold or glint from polished lapis. It simmered in bronze pots etched with sacred motifs. It roasted slowly over carefully selected woods, releasing sweet and savory aromas into the night. It smoked gently beneath clay lids while musicians played reed flutes. Dancers moved with controlled grace, and priests offered libations to household gods. This was a time when power was not only displayed through fortifications or armies, but performed, ritualized, and reinforced through cuisine. Influence could be tasted. To bring the sea to an inland table, to offer ocean flavors far from the shoreline, was to demonstrate your dominion not only over people, but over distance, trade, and time itself. Imagine, now, a great ceremonial hall atop a high plateau. The walls whitewashed and glistening under the fading gold of a long afternoon. The sky above turns amber, then rose, then deep purple as dusk descends. The stones of the courtyard are still warm beneath your feet from the heat of day. The tables are low and long, carved from olive wood, dark and veined with age. The cushions beneath are dyed with crushed flowers and woven with bronze-threaded patterns passed down for generations. Barefoot servants move like shadows across mosaic floors, balancing clay platters etched with sacred spirals and curling waves, remnants of a visual language lost to time. And upon these platters, no barley cakes or goat cheese alone, but oily, glistening mackerel from the far coast, roasted and dusted with powdered coriander. Spiny lobsters, rare and steaming, their scarlet shells still carrying whispers of the sea breeze. Thin slices of dried mullet wrapped in fragrant fig leaves, softened by the journey and warmed by flame. Eel roasted over applewood, its skin blistered and crisp, its scent rising in small clouds of memory. Bream, poached with leeks and date. Tuna pickled in sharp wine vinegar, pierced through with slivers of pressed garlic. All prepared with methods passed from one generation of cooks to the next. Each family keeping their own secrets close, like sacred spells. These meals were never solely about nourishment. The elites of Bronze Age societies, whether they ruled from the labyrinthine Minoan palaces, the warlike Mycenaean, or the imposing citadels of the Hittites, understood the seductive power of the distant, the exotic, the rare. They mastered long-distance trade. They filled stone jars with saffron and cinnamon, locked them behind ivory inlaid doors, and served dishes whose ingredients had traveled further than many of the guests. Ivory spoons, bronze skewers, and polished obsidian bowls turned every bite into performance. Each course whispered, "I have access. I have reach. I am not bound by my geography, but expand beyond it." Archaeological remnants confirm these stories, if you know where to listen. In the refuse heaps of elite homes near hearths, long grown cold under broken roof tiles and shattered frescoes lie the clues. Fish bones meticulously cleaned, charred shell fragments from oysters not native to nearby waters, fragments of imported amphorae, once heavy with preserved delicacies. The story is told in remnants, in traces. Not what they said, but what they served. And there was more than fish. Salted anchovies, pressed tightly into ceramic jars sealed with wax. Dried shellfish, smoked until it could survive weeks of rough travel. Briny sauces thick with herbs, layered with vinegar, dark as ink and just as bold. Fermented fish precursors to the Roman garum whose pungency lingered not only on the tongue, but in the air long after the feast had ended. These were not just condiments. They were declarations. To serve them was to invite. To prepare them was an art, and to eat them was to be part of a carefully constructed world, where meaning was measured not only in words, but in flavors. There were, too, the rituals around the meal. The washing of hands with rose water infused with pine resin. The blessing of the hearth fire with a few drops of honeyed wine. The chant sung before the first bite was taken, invoking the protection of the ancestors. The hush before the first platter was unveiled, when conversation quieted and all eyes turned. These were performances etched deep into the cultural script. A meal was never just deposit, was a reweaving of order, a reaffirmation of the cosmos in miniature. It was also an echo chamber of memory. Every recipe, every technique carried within it echoes of past generations. The spice combinations whispered of desert trade routes. The fish curing methods recalled shipbuilders' knowledge of salt and smoke. Even the way a table was set, how a spoon rested against a bowl, how a guest was greeted had its genealogy. To eat was not just to taste, but to remember. To remember who you were, who you descended from, and who you might become. And there were politics at the table, too. Not the kind shouted in open forums, but the quiet, simmering negotiations made over wine and cuttlefish stew. Marriages were proposed beside roasting spits. Borders were softened by a shared liking for pomegranate sauce. Wars were delayed by a perfectly prepared octopus. This was the diplomacy of the senses, where your palate became your parchment, and your appetite your signature. Food, in these palace courtyards and banquet chambers, was never just sustenance. It was theater. It was ritual. It was a silent negotiation of alliances, a reaffirmation of hierarchy, a remembrance of ancestors, and a projection of future power. A feast might accompany a wedding, a seasonal rite, the return of a caravan, or simply the moon's passing from one phase to another. A table could serve as throne and altar, and each guest's seat was a message. You belong, you are honored, you are remembered. Now, close your eyes. Let the sky fade into velvet black above. Listen to the soft crackle of cedar wood in the brazier, the hum of insects in the distance, the murmur of wind-dark laughter from neighboring tables. In your hand rests a thin slice of grilled eel, its surface lacquered with honey and date syrup. Around you, the air hangs heavy with spice and smoke. Someone pours warm wine into your cup, its scent sweet and sharp, like the memory of something once forgotten. You do not know the name of the fisherman who pulled this creature from the deep. You do not know the name of the caravan that bore it across the valleys. But here, under the stars, with 1,000 miles and weeks behind every flavor you know, you are part of something ancient, something orchestrated. From the bone-numbing labor of coastal fishermen to the perfumed halls of inland feasts, the sea threads them together. One cast the net with blistered hands. The other cast the invitation, gilded and precise. One stood barefoot in salt water, the other reclined on embroidered cushions. Both depended on the sea, its bounty, its risk, its wonder, its memory, and between them, always the fish, the salt, the timeless, enduring language of food.
Imagine yourself aboard a Phoenician merchant ship. The sea hums beneath the hull. The sails creak in a shifting wind, and the stars above shimmer through the haze of distance and time. Here, history breathes in the briny air, mingling with memory and myth. This is not a tale of great battles or famous kings, not just yet. This journey begins in the shadows, deep in the cramped, dark underbelly of a Phoenician trade vessel. There, amid sacks of purple dye and jars of salted fish, humanity endured. And tonight, you will too. Let your thoughts drift with the tide, as we explore what it truly meant to live and labor aboard the ships of the Phoenicians. We'll meet Hanno the navigator, voyage alongside the enigma of the sea peoples, and glimpse the elite who ruled from the comfort of dry land. So find your quiet place, let the lights dim, and with each word, allow the weight of the day to slip away, like waves retreating from a stony shore. Our journey begins now in the dark, where breath is short, space is tighter still, and the past waits, patient beneath the deck. The Phoenician ship was not built for comfort. These were not luxury liners gliding gently over the sea, nor were they mighty warships designed for glory and conquest. They were narrow, low-slung, cedarwood vessels constructed for a single purpose: trade. And the humans aboard, especially those below deck, were more cargo than crew. Imagine the smell first. Not the clean scent of the ocean above, fresh with brine and breeze. Below deck, it was a different world entirely. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of oil-soaked rope, stale fish, human sweat, and the unmistakable tang of damp wood beginning to rot. Add to that the musty odor of grain sacks, the acrid sting of spilled wine, and the lingering sourness of sickness. Barrels of salted mackerel and amphorae of wine leaked slowly into the planks. Vermin scurried freely, thriving in the shadows. Rats nested in corners, mice nibbled through grain sacks, and insects crawled the crevices with quiet diligence. You lie there shoulder to shoulder with others, packed in like goods. There is no privacy, no silence, no separation. The floor shifts beneath you, constantly, never still and above. The dull thump of sailors' feet or the muffled crash of shifting cargo reminds you that life is always in motion. Light below deck came only from a few dim oil lamps, small, flickering, and easily snuffed out by a sudden wave. The darkness swallowed shape and time. Day blurred into night. Time passed not by the sun, but by the creak of timbers, the rhythms of meals, and the rise and fall of the waves. Food was a monotonous ritual. Hard bread that cracked teeth, lentils boiled to mush, dry figs or dates if you were fortunate, sometimes sour or crawling with bugs. Water was stored in leather skins or clay jars and turned foul quickly, flavored by mildew or mold. Scurvy crept in like a whisper, its signs slow and grim, gums that bled without warning, limbs that ached and swelled, old wounds refusing to heal. The lucky ones noticed early. The others' weekend faded. Washing, a rare and risky act. Buckets of seawater poured sparingly, often too salty for comfort, too cold for relief. Clean clothes were treasures, usually saved for port visits. Illness spread with ruthless speed. A single cough could spell danger. There were no physicians on board, no herbalists, no remedies. Only superstition and prayers to foreign gods. And yet, in the midst of all this, there was routine. A strange rhythm to the discomfort. Men would rise, stretch their backs in the cramped space, and tend to small tasks. They would patch clothes with needle and gut thread. They would rewrap cargo, check the stores, whisper songs from home through cracked lips. Outside, the sea was vast and indifferent. Storms rolled across the water with little warning. Rain would pour through the hatch. The ship would pitch and groan like something living, its bones straining under the weight of wind and wave. Seasickness was constant. For some, it never ended the unsteady roll of the world their only reality. And still they sailed. For weeks, sometimes months, they sailed. From Tyre to Carthage, from Sidon to the Pillars of Hercules, hauling cedar wood, glass beads, ivory, papyrus, and textiles dyed in the blood-red hue of murex shellfish, a purple so rare it clothed only the wealthiest of kings. Every port brought the promise of coin, of release, of land underfoot, the hope of warmth, of a bathhouse, of silence. But it was short-lived. Soon enough, the cargo was reloaded. The hatches shut, and the darkness returned. The rhythm of their lives was simple, repetitive, endured more than enjoyed. But through that struggle, the Phoenicians laid down the roots of something enduring, a web of commerce, culture, and connection that stretched across the ancient sea. For those below deck, greatness was not a reward. It was a story told in hindsight. Their days were not marked by ambition or legacy, but by survival, one wave at a time. And survival in those damp wooden bellies of the sea was never guaranteed. Now, as the deck creaks above us and the ship turns slowly toward distant shores, let us rise gently from the hold. It is time to meet a man who did not sleep in. Let the swell of the sea carry us now, slowly and steadily, away from the cramped, humid darkness of the cargo hold. Rise with the breeze, with the hum of rigging and the gentle slap of waves against wood, and find yourself upon a different deck entirely, a deck kissed not by damp gloom, but by golden sunlight. It is a deck that carries promise, curiosity, and the weight of ambition. It is steered by the hand of one man whose gaze stretched further than the horizon, further than maps dared mark. His name was Hanno the navigator. Not a name carved in monuments or echoed in triumphal songs. Not a name sung by poets or etched into stone by empires. But to those who whispered in the markets of Carthage, and to the sailors who followed the coastlines beyond sight of home, he was a legend. A Phoenician by spirit, a Carthaginian by birth, born not to kings or conquerors, but to trade, to salt, to cedar-scented halls lined with amphory. His world was one of tides and timetables, not thrones and laurels. He grew up in the bustling streets of Carthage, the great daughter city of Tyre, where sails bloomed like flowers in the harbor and the scent of olives mingled with the calls of foreign tongues. There, amid the bronze scales and papyrus maps, young Hanno dreamed not of conquest, but of coasts unseen, of waters not yet named, of distant lands whispered about in sailors' tales. It was sometime in the early 5th century BCE when Carthage, flush with trade and ambition, turned its eyes southward. The world known to the Phoenicians ended at the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond that was the outer ocean, the wild Atlantic. And further still, the dark unknown that frightened some and beckoned others. Hanno was chosen to sail into it. He was given ships perhaps as many as 60, though the number is debated and entrusted with settlers, animals, and supplies. His orders were threefold: expand trade, establish colonies, and chart what lay beyond. Some say he sought fertile lands for farming. Others say it was gold, spices, or simply prestige. But perhaps it was also a quest for understanding. And so they departed, past the edge of maps, past the whispering straits, into a sea that rolled unbroken. Southward they went. First came the familiar, Lixus, the northern outpost where the rivers met the sea and locals knew the traders by name. There they replenished. But soon after, the familiar gave way to the unknown. Hanno and his fleet moved further, planting small colonies along the coast, places where ships could rest and gather. They built altars and left offerings, naming new places as they sailed past, but always the ships pointed south. The coastline twisted, greened, steepened. Tall forests stretched to the sky. Volcanoes simmered in the distance, coughing smoke into a thick, humid sky. The sea darkened in color, reflecting the depth and mystery below. Great birds soared overhead, unlike any seen in Tyre or Sidon. Nights glowed with unfamiliar constellations. The rhythm of their lives changed as they entered this new maritime world. They encountered people, two tribes, unfamiliar, some open, some cautious. There were exchanges of goods, of glances, of gestures made without shared language. Hanno's account, preserved in a Greek translation known as the Periplus of Hanno, describes these moments with curious brevity. Yet behind the terse words, an entire world pulses: curiosity, fear, awe, and fragile diplomacy. Among the strangest entries is his mention of hairy men and women who fled into the forests. Unable to capture them alive, his crew killed and skinned one female. He named them the Gorillai, a term that centuries later would lend its name to the apes of Central Africa. Perhaps they were gorillas, perhaps baboons, perhaps something lost to history. But to Hanno and his men, they were an enigma of the wilderness, the living embodiment of the unknown. And still they pressed on. But ambition is fed by supplies, and supplies, on the edge of the world, grow short. The farther they pushed, the more fragile their position became. The seas grew more temperamental, the coasts more treacherous, the air thick with humidity. Food began to spoil. The livestock they brought struggled in the dense heat. The sailors whispered of turning back. Eventually, Hanno could go no further. His men were restless. The stores were low. The terrain too wild, the coast too jagged. The unknown so long pursued became a boundary once more. He stood at the edge of exploration, at the border between myth and map, and chose return over ruin, and so he turned homeward. They sailed north, the wake behind them a silent record of what they had seen. They returned to Carthage, bearing stories, accounts, perhaps sketches and specimens, but not gold, not slaves, not conquest. And in this, his fate was sealed. Some say he was welcomed with honors. Others suggest Carthage expected more. Perhaps his journey was seen as costly, unprofitable. Perhaps those in power, who had never smelled the southern jungles or watched the sun rise over unfamiliar peaks, found his tailies less valuable than a full cargo hold. Whatever the truth, history grew quiet around his name. No temple bore it. No city was named for him. His voyage survived in a parchment, a translation, a handful of lines that described a journey unlike any other in the ancient world. Yet, even in obscurity, Hanno endured. For what he offered was not dominion or spoils, but perspective. He showed his world that there was more beyond the edge, that the known was but a sliver of the real, that the sea rolled on long after the map stopped. And tonight, as you lie still, listening to the hush between sentences, imagine Hanno at the prow of his ship, wind tugging at his cloak, eyes on the unknown. Imagine the sound of breakers on a coast no one had named, the cry of strange birds, the scent of flowering trees carried on the warm wind. He did not chase fame, yet he found a kind of immortality. He sailed farther. He dared more quietly than most, but with a courage that left ripples on history's surface. Now let your breath deepen. Let the waves of sleep roll closer. Ahead, in the next chapter of our journey, we look not to one man, but to a mystery of force that surged from the sea without warning. The sea peoples, unseen, unnamed, unstoppable. Who were they? What did they want? And why did entire civilizations crumble before their sails? Close your eyes. Drift deeper. Imagine, for a moment, a calm sea at dusk. The water, glassy and gold-tinted, stretches endlessly before you. A lone bird cuts across the horizon, and in the stillness, there is peace. But history, even in its gentlest hours, holds beneath its surface great disruptions, currents of upheaval moving slowly and then, all at once, crashing forward. Let us return to a time now long past when the Eastern Mediterranean thrived with interconnected civilizations. Along the shores of Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean, great cities gleamed. Trade flowed like a lifeblood, moving copper, tin, textiles, wine, and grain across borders and between cultures. Mycenaean kings ruled from fortress palaces. The Hittites maintained their mighty bureaucracy from Hattusa. Ugarit was alive with scribes, merchants, and travelers. And in Egypt, temples stood tall in the light of Ra, echoing with hymns of stability and divine order. And then, in the span of only a few decades, this luminous tapestry began to unravel. Sometime between the 13th and 12th centuries BCE, a vast disruption surged across the region. Cities burned, settlements vanished. Writing systems disappeared. Entire kingdoms faltered. What followed is often called the Late Bronze Age collapse. And at the heart of this convulsion, echoing from fragmentary records, we find cryptic references to a confederation of attackers. Their name is lost, but we know them today as the Sea Peoples. They are among the greatest enigmas of the ancient world. This modern label, Sea Peoples, was coined by scholars based on references found in Egyptian records, especially those inscribed during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III. These writings describe waves of invaders, coming by both land and sea, armed for conquest, accompanied by families and ox carts. Their intention was not mere raiding. They came, it seemed, to destroy and then to stay. Depictions of these people on temple walls at Medinet Habu show them with distinctive dress, horned helmets, feathered headgear, round shields, and short curved swords. Their ships had curious features, sometimes resembling both Egyptian and Aegean styles, with high prows and rowing benches filled with desperate, determined men. Their presence was felt not just in battle, but in the shaking foundations of the known world. But who were they truly? The question has haunted historians and archaeologists alike. Theories abound and evidence is fragmentary. Some suggest they were displaced Mycenaeans, whose homelands had been devastated by internal strife or natural disasters. Others trace their origins to the Western Mediterranean, perhaps Sardinia, Corsica, or Sicily, or even to regions northward, in the Balkans or along the Adriatic coast. Some posit they were mercenaries, once employed by great kings, now turned against them in a desperate bid for survival. Others imagine them as seafaring coalitions, a loose confederation of different ethnic and cultural groups bound by mutual hardship. Wherever they came from, their effect was seismic. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in flames. Ugarit, a jewel of Canaanite trade and culture, was consumed almost overnight. Archaeological layers show a city bustling with life one season and reduced to ash the next. The Hittite Empire crumbled, its imperial heartland emptied, its records falling silent. In Cyprus, ports were devastated. Even Egypt, though it repelled the invaders through immense effort, was weakened. Its economy strained, its institutions hollowed. The great monuments stood, but the world that had built them began to erode. The Sea Peoples left behind no clear chronicles, only ruin and the occasional tantalizing hint. One such trace comes from a clay tablet sent in desperation by a Ugaritic official. "My father, the enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my cities. The situation is desperate." This message, never delivered, was preserved by chance when the city fell. Other fragments include unusual weaponry found in destruction layers, suggesting foreign influence or origin. Pottery styles change abruptly after their passage, signaling the end of certain artistic traditions and the birth of others. In this way, the Sea Peoples may not have vanished, but instead became woven into the evolving cultural landscape of the Iron Age. Some scholars argue that these groups did not simply vanish back into the sea. Instead, they settled in newly conquered lands. In Philistia, for instance, the emergence of the Philistines coincides suspiciously with the Sea Peoples' incursions. Their language, diet, and material culture point to origins outside the Levant. Could these have been Sea Peoples who remained, reshaped by time and circumstance? It is possible that the Sea Peoples were not just destroyers, but also migrants' families displaced by famine, climate change, and war. The period was marked by widespread droughts, resource shortages, and political instability. In this view, the Sea Peoples become not mere villains of history, but participants in a broader crisis. Desperation, after all, can drive entire societies to the sea. Imagine their ships, creaking under the weight of families, livestock, and crude supplies. Children crying softly in the hold. Farmers gripping makeshift weapons. Navigators scanning the stars with weary eyes. Their homeland may have been lost to fire or blight, and so they followed the water, hoping for refuge, for soil to till, for peace. Not all were warriors, many were survivors. They brought not only destruction, but also their culture, beliefs, and memories. The sea, that eternal expanse, gave them passage and power. Their story remains uncertain, but their legacy endures. In their wake, they left destruction, but also transformation. The end of the Bronze Age ushered in the Iron Age, a period of smaller, more localized polities, new technologies, and cultural shifts. From chaos, a different order slowly emerged. New languages evolved. Trade resumed on a smaller, more regional scale. And in time, new kingdoms rose where the old had fallen. And now, as you breathe in the quiet, let the mystery of the Sea Peoples rest lightly on your mind. Let it not trouble, but rather intrigue. Not every question demands an answer. Sometimes the unknown is its own kind of wisdom. Sleep, like history, has its tides ebbing, flowing, wrapping us gently in forgetting. As we drift on, the next chapter lies ahead. We leave the worn sails and silent ships of the Sea Peoples and journey now into a different kind of seafaring, a world not of hunger and fear, but of elegance, wealth, and control. The world of kings and merchants, of gilded cabins and strategic ports, of those who ruled the waves not with oars, but with orders. Close your eyes. We sail again soon. Let us now shift our gaze from desperation to decadence, from the rough, salt-stained hands of survivors to the perfumed fingertips of those who charted the seas not out of necessity, but for glory, commerce, and dominion. We drift into a time when the Mediterranean was not merely a survival route, but a stage upon which the powerful performed their grand maritime ambitions. This was the age of command, of wealth afloat, of oceanic prestige. Here, ships did not flee, they arrived in style. They pulled into harbors with fanfare, flanked by guards and draped in banners. Ports became theaters of display, where tribute was expected and diplomacy was choreographed like a courtly dance. Imagine, if you will, the early morning hush of a Phoenician harbor at the height of its influence. The sun, just cresting the horizon, casts golden light across a bay filled with swaying masts. Ships with polished hulls glimmer as elite sailors, dressed in finely stitched tunics of dyed linen, supervise the offloading of precious cargo. Amphorae of aged wine, bundles of cinnamon bark, dyed textiles of vivid purple, and fragile glassware of mesmerizing hues. Scribes sit beneath canopies, quills poised over ledgers, noting each transaction in precise detail. There is no urgency here, only the rhythm of wealth in motion. These are not the desperate journeys of displaced peoples. These are voyages planned in council chambers, funded by treasuries, and protected by fleets. The ruling elite Phoenician magnates, Greek strategoi, Egyptian high priests, and Persian satraps understood the sea not as a wild and untamed force, but as an ordered avenue of control. It was a silk road of waves, connecting capitals to colonies, gods to gifts, rulers to distant whispers of tribute. To them, the ocean was a grand chessboard. Trade routes doubled as military corridors. Control of a strait meant leverage over grain prices. A well-timed naval escort could secure a diplomatic marriage or destabilize a rival's economy. It was not just about movement, but mastery. They projected influence across the waves the way a monarch extends a scepter gracefully, but with full expectation of obedience. And these maritime elites did not move in silence. Their presence was seen in grand architectural expressions, dockyards carved from limestone, warehouses lined in cedar, lighthouses that burn through the night like eternal beacons of power. In cities like Tyre, Sidon, Carthage, and Piraeus, the sea was not only a neighbor, it was an extension of the palace. Step aboard one of their ships, and you step into a floating court. The deck gleams with imported timber. Decorative awnings flutter gently. Captains, often nobler-born, issue commands in steady, practiced voices, surrounded by scribes, stewards, and guards. These vessels are not only tools of transport, they are platforms of protocol. Beneath the deck, however, the contrast sharpens. There, in dim and airless quarters, rows of oarsmen labor. Some are slaves. Others are hired hands. Their hands blister and their backs ache in rhythm with the beat of a drum. Above, there is laughter. Wine cups clink, deals are discussed in murmurs. Trade agreements are inked. Naval escorts arranged. The very act of sailing has become ceremonial, an exhibition of one's wealth, network, and intelligence. Each voyage is a performance of power. The elite's influence did not end at the water's edge. Inland, the fruits of maritime control blossomed in the form of vast estates, temple complexes, and cultural endowments. In the villas of the well-born, you might find African ivory carved into furniture, Eastern spices steeping in clay pots, and wall murals celebrating seaborne conquests. Marble busts of ancestors gaze down upon rooms adorned with maps of known coastlines, reflecting the family's reach. Coinage bore the symbols of ships. Offerings to the gods included miniature galleys and bronze. Festivals celebrated safe returns from sea and honored deities who watched over commerce. Maritime dominance was woven into the religious, political, and social identity of these elites. To control the waves was to claim the favor of the divine. And yet, beneath all the ceremony and success lay the ever-present reality of dependence. Their fortunes rode the swells. A lost shipment could ripple through a kingdom's economy. A blockade could break an alliance. A single storm could scatter years of planning. Even for the mighty, the sea remained unpredictable. This makes the story of the ancient maritime world not just one of grandeur, but of fragility. It is a contrast drawn in salt and gold. On one hand, we have the sea peoples, desperate, migratory, burning cities out of necessity. On the other, the elite mariners calculated, adorned, building cities out of opportunity. Both navigated the same waters, but from different ends of power and purpose. And together, their intertwined legacies shaped the basin we now call the cradle of civilization. Now, let the wind slacken. Let the sails luff in the breeze. Let this vivid contrast settle into your thoughts. The aching arms of the rower, the perfumed fingers of the aristocrat, both moving over the same dark waters. Sleep calls, and with it, the hush of centuries. Let it take you gently, as a quiet tide might cradle a weary hull. The night is calm, the sea is waiting, and history, as always, whispers. We drift toward the very edge of the world, to the windswept towers of stone and steel, to the lighthouses and the solitary souls who kept their lanterns burning through storm and shadow. Imagine yourself high above crashing waves, perched on a jagged outpost of rock, far from any town, far from comfort, far even from trees or birds or the casual human touch. The wind presses constantly against the thick stone walls, never ceasing, a pressure like breath on your neck. And the mournful groan of the foghorn sounds through the dark, long and low, a sound that finds its way into your bones. This is where we begin, not with excitement, but with endurance. With quiet mornings that feel identical to the last. With cold meals, with the taking of barometers, and with eyes that scan the sea not for beauty, but for danger. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore the isolated and often forgotten lives of lighthouse keepers, their daily struggles, their lonely rituals, the tempests that came for them, the tragedies they survived, and sometimes those they did not. We'll listen to the haunting story of Grace Darling, the quiet heroine of a desperate rescue. We'll uncover eerie tales of vanished lighthouses and the strange silences they left behind. And we'll close with a look at the fragile, often frustrating web of officials and families who made their homes in the light's long shadow. So settle in. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the sea. You are safe now. You are warm. You have nothing to fear. Let the waves roll on. Let the flame glow steady. And let us begin our quiet watch. Imagine you've woken up before dawn, not from an alarm, but from habit. Your body knows the rhythm. The wind sighs outside your window, a low and constant presence, like a distant voice you've grown too used to hearing. You rise slowly without urgency. There's no schedule but your own, and no one to rush for, only the slow, repeating schedule of light and tide and time. You pull on a thick wool sweater, rough but warm. The scent of salt has worked its way into the fibers. Every stitch smells faintly of sea air, smoke, and the lingering touch of old oil and damp stone. You light the stove. The fire cracks softly in the iron belly of it, and the kettle begins to simmer. There is no conversation, no footsteps. Just the hiss of the flame, the whistle of the kettle, and the whisper of wind between the cracks of old mortar. The keeper's day begins not with chaos, but with quiet repetition. Your tasks are unchanging, and yet they shape everything. You climb the narrow spiral stairs to the top of the tower, the lantern room. The steps echo underfoot, a steady rhythm that marks your presence. 1, 2, 1, 2. No rush. There is time. At the top, you're greeted by the wide arc of glass, thick and weather-worn. These panels look out across the endless gray sea. On foggy mornings, the world disappears into white. The horizon erases itself. On clear days, you can see farther than the mind can hold. Though such days are rare, you inspect the lens, clean the prisms, check the oil levels or the kerosene tanks depending on the decade. You wipe down the brass. Make sure the lamp is trimmed. In later years, you might flip switches instead of lighting wicks. But the meaning never changed. If the light fails, ships will die. The weight of that truth presses against your chest like the fog presses the glass. Beside you sits the logbook, a simple thing, a record of days. You know the temperature, the barometric pressure, wind direction, sea state, visibility. Each detail entered in tidy script, part of a long line of keepers who wrote the same details before you. Some days, you do not speak a single word. Not one. In remote stations, rocky outposts like Bell Rock or Skerryvore in Scotland, or Eddystone off the English coast, supply ships came only once every few weeks. Sometimes less in winter. You ration food carefully. Sacks of flour, a dwindling pile of potatoes, preserved meats, tins of condensed milk, hard biscuits. Nothing fresh. Fresh water is gathered from rainfall, stored in iron tanks, or brought by boat. There is no market, no errand to run. No street to walk, just rock. Just sea. Just your boots against the stone, your shadow moving across the walls. The radio crackles now and then. A bulletin? A forecast? A scratchy conversation with the next light down the coast, if they're listening. But most of your speech is inward. You speak to yourself. You hum. You listen to the silence. You keep the light. You keep the watch. That is your duty. In winter, the sea becomes a different thing entirely. Not just large, angry, possessive. Waves smash against the foundation with such force that dishes rattle and the tower sways. One keeper at Fastnet described the sensation of water overtaking the entire height of the tower, watching the glass bow inward, warping under pressure. Nights when the ocean seemed to claw at the structure, trying to pull it down. You mend your nets. You check the generator or the crank wheel. You repaint chipped walls, polish worn hinges, and wait. Wait for ships to pass. Wait for the wind to change. Wait for your replacement, if one is coming. Sometimes there are 3 of you, sometimes 2, sometimes just 1. And in those solitary posts, the weight of silence becomes something real. Not an absence, a presence. A thing you can almost hear breathing. Isolation was not just physical. It chipped away at the mind. A slow erosion like the sea shaping stone. Men wrote letters to themselves. They copied out books by hand. They invented games. Drew chalk lines to track the days, then weeks. One keeper wrote the Lord's Prayer backward, simply for the mental exercise. Another carved entire chess sets from driftwood and played both sides of every game. Others built ships in bottles or counted the seconds between waves. And always the foghorn, a deep, mournful sound, a cry in the night. It does not cease, it does not tire. Even in sleep, you still hear it. In dreams, it moans, a sound like the earth itself trying to remember. But the light must burn. In the lighthouse, each night arrives like the last. As the sun dips beneath the edge of the world, you trim the wick, light the mantle, set the weights, or engage the motor. The lens begins its patient spin, casting its beam out across the wide, cold dark. You watch it blink once, twice, and then again, a heartbeat in the void. Somewhere out there, someone sees that light. Somewhere, a captain alters his course. A fisherman breathes easier. And you, alone in the dark, have kept them safe. That is your duty. That is your life. That is the rhythm. And now, with the sea still breathing beside us, and silence wrapping gently around your thoughts, we drift onward ... to a tale not of solitude, but of sudden, heroic fury and its cost. Close your eyes now and picture a world of fog, a world where sound travels strangely, where distance lies, where shapes emerge and vanish again in the blink of an eye. This is the domain of lighthouses, and it is also a world where sometimes things simply disappear. You may think of lighthouses as permanent strongholds against time and sea, yet many have vanished without explanation, some slowly eroded by waves, others swallowed in silence. In this segment, we turn toward the strange and unspoken, stories where history leaves behind only suggestion, rumor, or a final entry in a faded logbook. Our first tale brings us to the coast of Scotland, to a place where the Atlantic crashes into bare rock and cloud, the Flannan Isles. A lonely cluster of crags, windswept and almost uninhabitable. They were chosen in the late 19th century as the site of a new lighthouse. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was completed in 1899, built with immense difficulty on Eilean Moor, the largest of the Isles. High on a grassy rise, its light would serve passing ships in one of the most treacherous corners of the British coastline. 3 keepers were assigned at a time, with a rotating 4th on leave. Then came December of 1900. The lighthouse supply ship, the Hesperus, arrived to bring relief and provisions. But as it neared the island, something felt ... wrong. There was no one to greet them. No flag raised, no supply boxes waiting. The landing was empty. When the crew climbed to the lighthouse, they found it silent. Inside, the fireplace was cold. Food remained uneaten. 2 oilskin coats were missing. 1 pair of boots remained. The logbook stopped on December 15th. The 3 keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur, had vanished. No sign of struggle, no wreckage, no distress signal ever sent. Just an empty tower. An official investigation concluded that a storm had likely swept the men away. Perhaps 2 had gone out to secure ropes or a crane. Perhaps the 3rd had rushed to help. But the theory, while plausible, didn't explain everything. Why would 3 seasoned keepers, knowing the risk, all venture outside? Why leave 1 pair of boots? The mystery of the Flannan Isles captured imaginations. Theories multiplied. Some claimed supernatural forces. Others spoke of madness, of one man turning on the others. Some said a rogue wave rose higher than the cliffs themselves. But no evidence ever surfaced. And so the Flannan Lighthouse remains a beacon still, but haunted not by ghosts, only by absence. Other lighthouses, too, have stories that end not with closure, but with silence. On the American coast in 1931, the crew of the Penfield Reef Lighthouse reported hearing the voice of a former keeper, Frederick Jordan, calling from the sea on stormy nights. He had drowned while rowing back from the mainland years earlier. His replacement swore he saw Jordan's figure walking the tower, trimming lamps that no longer burned. In Michigan's remote White Shoal Light, isolated in the middle of Lake Michigan, keepers reported hearing strange music echoing through the fog, violent strains where there should be only wind. Men stationed alone there often asked for early transfer. Some went home and never spoke of their time again. And then there are the lights themselves, entire structures lost. The Tillamook Rock Lighthouse in Oregon, nicknamed Terrible Tilly, was built on an isolated basalt rock, constantly assaulted by waves. During construction, a worker was swept into the sea. During operation, windows shattered under wave pressure. One year, a crematory company used it to store urns of ashes, then abandoned them when the lighthouse was decommissioned. Today, it stands ruined, empty, a tower without purpose, staring out at the Pacific. Each of these stories shares a theme: the loneliness of duty, the silence that comes when the wind rises and the sea turns cold, a life bound to light, surrounded by dark. What happened to the men of the Flannan Isles? What are the echoes heard on stormy nights at Penfield Reef? These questions do not ask to be solved. They simply linger, part of the long hush of history. And so, now we drift onward again, out of the fog and toward the mainland, where the keepers' lives crossed with those of government men, inspectors, families, and all the bureaucracy that tried, in vain, to control the chaos of the sea. Let the fog thin now, just a little, like the lifting of a gauze curtain at the end of a long and storm-tossed night. Let us drift gently away from the stark outline of the towers themselves, their lanterns dim in the distance, and step, instead, into quieter spaces, into narrow kitchens thick with the scent of boiled tea and paraffin. into cramped, sea-damp bedrooms where handwritten letters lie folded on knitstands, into cluttered government offices where clerks, far from any coast, attempt to tame chaos with charts and ink. In this final segment, we pull back the lens and turn to those who moved around the towers, the families of the keepers, the men of paper and policy, and the delicate fraying web of connection between solitude and bureaucracy. Life as a lighthouse keeper was, for many, a vocation, a solemn duty. But for the families, wives, children, siblings, parents, it became something more complicated. It was a life on the edge of a map and the edge of society. Sometimes literally when families lived in the tower. Sometimes emotionally when the keeper lived alone for weeks or months at sea. The consequences were not only personal, but deeply woven into social and financial survival. For the wives who accompanied their husbands to isolated lighthouses, life became an exercise in stoic resourcefulness. They rationed flour, salt, and dried peas with the precision of naval quartermasters. In the absence of fresh milk, they learned to make do with condensed tins. They grew what herbs and hardy greens they could in weather-beaten barrels or small, windswept plots of earth scraped from between rocks. They tended wounds, soothed feverish children, gave birth in solitude, sometimes without help, save for a mirror and steady nerves. And when death came, as it sometimes did, it arrived without ceremony. Sometimes the body had to be wrapped and stored in a cool room until the next boat could come, days or weeks later. Children of lighthouse families grew up on the fringe of both nature and society. Their playgrounds were sharp rocks and steep cliffs. Their toys were fashioned from driftwood, worn rope, bits of brass, and shell. They spoke in low voices, taught from a young age to respect the silence their fathers needed between shifts. They learned to read early, books were precious, and they learned to wait. For the weather to clear, for the boat to come, for the postman who might only visit once a fortnight. Illness was treated with home remedies and stubbornness. Play was quiet. Dreams sometimes had no room to grow. Back on the mainland, in stuffy government buildings hundreds of miles away, officials attempted to oversee these lonely outposts. In Britain, Trinity House issued guidelines down to the type of oil to be used, the expected condition of uniform buttons, and the angle at which journal entries should be written. In the US, the lighthouse board sent inspectors with clipboards and rigid expectations. Light must never go out. Wicks must be trimmed hourly. Lenses must shine without streak or smudge. Logs had to be legible, timely, thorough. There was very little room for grace. Inspections were feared. They could happen at any time in any weather, and they disrupted the delicate rhythm of daily life. An inspector might arrive soaked and surly, pick through a pantry, lift bedding for dust, test the light for its reach. A single mark against a keeper, a smudge on the lantern, a note of sarcasm in a journal entry could spell demotion, dismissal, or disgrace. Politics, of course, crept in even here. Some inspectors were fair and thoughtful, others vindictive. Promotions could be given or withheld not on merit, but on favor. In small coastal villages, the lighthouse keeper's family occupied a curious social space, neither fully part of the town nor entirely apart from it. Keepers might be respected, guardians of safety, eyes in the storm, or they might be distrusted, too silent, too strange, too wrapped in routines no one else quite understood. Children were sometimes welcomed, sometimes teased. Wives might find allies among local women, or feel the sting of gossip and distance. Tensions sometimes arose between families stationed at nearby lights. Rivalries simmered quietly. Reports of sabotage, whispered, but persistent, flickered through the archives. A keeper might tamper with another's logbook or gossip about their diligence. Wives might feud over supplies or status. In small, closed worlds, small slights cast long shadows. And yet, there was solidarity too, a shared understanding of a life no outsider could quite fathom. Keepers' wives would write letters on one another's behalf when one fell ill. Children would play together when the boats allowed. If tragedy struck, and it did, families banded together. Wages were pooled. Meals shared. In a harsh and indifferent world, they made their own small systems of care. The government, in its efforts to regulate, created layers of order. instruction manuals, equipment inventories, behavior protocols. Yet these systems often buckled beneath reality. A keeper's failure to log a storm might stem not from negligence, but from being injured and alone. A tower might go dark not because of sloth, but because a vital part failed and resupply had been delayed by 10 days of gale. The system had little room for nuance and no mechanism for mercy. Some keepers, when their careers ended, wrote memoirs. Their tones were often a mix of pride and resignation. Others slipped quietly into civilian life, back to farming, fishing, shopkeeping. Their children, raised on rock and wave, moved inland and found other paths. By the mid-20th century, automation rendered many lighthouse roles obsolete. The great engines of bureaucracy turned on, replacing flame with electricity, human presence with circuits. Some keepers wept to leave their towers. Others left in silence, never looking back. A few returned as tourists, decades later, to find their homes repainted, their tools displayed behind glass. And now the light changes again. We draw near to the end of our passage. The families, the officials, the inspectors and children, the ledgers and linens all drift now into the steady hush of the sea. What remains is memory. The memory of those who kept watch while others slept, who brought order to chaos not with conquest or command, but with patience and routine, who lived not for glory but for duty. Let us ease now toward shore. Let the past drift gently behind us like a buoy light fading on the horizon. And let us close with a soft reflection, a final ember in the long, patient glow of history. Voyages into the heart of Portugal's maritime empire not through the lens of conquest, but through the slow, persistent pulse of ambition, religious fervor, and nautical endurance. This is the kind of history not found in trumpet blasts, but in the routine of blistered hands, salt-worn maps, and whispered prayers under unfamiliar constellations. We'll begin with the daily life aboard a Portuguese carrack, a life far removed from the romance of modern adventure. Full of salt, sweat, and survival. Then we'll journey with Vasco da Gama on his fateful first expedition, a voyage marked by hope, conflict, and the unfamiliar shores of India. Next, we'll sink beneath the ocean's surface off the coast of Mozambique, where shipwrecks lie hidden like forgotten memories, cradled in coral and sand. And finally, we'll slip into the candlelit corridors of Lisbon's maritime palace, where politics, papal power, and royal ambition plotted the future of oceans yet unconquered. So breathe deeply. You are in no hurry. Let go of the day. Let the sea rock you gently in its ancient rhythm. The sails are full. The tide is steady. And the story, like the night, is just beginning. Picture yourself waking not in the warmth of your own bed, but in a dark, cramped berth carved into rough wood. The air is heavy with moisture, and it clings to your skin like a damp blanket. There's no morning sun streaming through curtains, no scent of breakfast or birdsong, only the distant crash of water against hull, and the creaking groan of timbers as the ship pitches in an endless rhythm. Overhead, faint daylight trickles through cracks, illuminating dust motes and the slow sway of ropes above. You are aboard a Portuguese carrack in the twilight of the 15th century, a floating microcosm of toil, discomfort, and muted hopes. These ships were the giants of their time, with broad, deep bellies for cargo, but their movement was ponderous and their comforts few. They were not sleek or swift. They were built to endure. Their bones were oak and pine, their muscles a web of canvas and rope, and their lifeblood the men who served aboard them often ran thin. Your day begins with orders barked in a hoarse voice, the kind hardened by salt air and command. You scramble from your hammock or pallet, careful not to knock your head on low beams. Already your clothes feel clammy, your skin rubbed raw from salt and coarse fabric. Your first task might be as mundane as cleaning the latrine buckets, or as demanding as hauling sails under wind that bites and whips with little mercy. Meals are sparse and repetitive. The biscuit is rock hard and peppered with tiny holes left by weevils. Salted pork or cod smells as old as the ship itself. You chew slowly, not out of mindfulness, but necessity lest your teeth crack. If there's any wine left, it's sharp and soured, but it masks the taste of stale water. Weeks pass with no fresh produce, and slowly your gums soften, your joints ache. Scurvy sets in silently. Below deck, the air is stagnant, thick with sweat, smoke, mildew, and the faint ammonia of waste. Rats dart between shadows, bold and swift. Some are hunted for food in desperate times. Others seem to haunt the men's dreams. Lice are unavoidable. Even the officers scratch. Pain is routine. Rope burns, blisters, open sores, splinters embedded deep. Salt stings every wound and infection spreads with little resistance. There are no doctors, only a surgeon's crude kit and prayers. Infections, when they come, are slow punishments. And always the ship rocks, never still, never silent. And then there is discipline. The captain's word is absolute. A careless mistake or defiant word may earn you a flogging on the main deck. The sound of the whip is not loud, but sharp like a sail snapping in sudden wind. Public punishment keeps order. The fear of exile or being marooned keeps mouths shut. Still, there are moments of quiet. Watching dolphins beneath the bow. A moment of windless peace at dawn. A hymn sung by sailors gathered in the dark. The soft scratch of quills updating the log. Time becomes water, it slips past slowly, but leaves everything changed. At night, you stare upward, if the clouds part. The stars are unfamiliar, yet they guide you. You pray to saints whose names you barely remember. You think of home, of land, of fruit, of clean clothes. You try to sleep, but the rats wake you. Someone snores nearby. The hull groans. You drift in and out of dreams. This was the unsung life of empire. Not conquistadors waving banners, but sailors breaking fingers, tying knots. Not heroes of legend, but men who endured. Their voyages gave rise to charts and ports and palaces. But first, they gave their skin to salt, their breath to damp air, their strength to sails. And so, with that image still lingering, the sway of the deck beneath you, the rough cloth against your skin, we prepare to follow in the wake of one of these men. A navigator, a commander, a symbol of ambition and cruelty. His name was Vasco da Gama. When you're ready, we'll follow his first voyage. Let us now rise slowly from the dim, sweat-slicked belly of the Carrack, climbing up through the narrow wooden hatch to the windswept deck above. The sea air is sharp and carries the heavy scent of salt and something more intangible ambition. Perhaps. As you squint against the dazzling light glinting off the restless waves, the coastline of Portugal begins to blur and retreat, fading into the morning haze. It is July of the year 1497, and you are aboard a ship destined not merely for foreign shores, but for the unknown. Vasco da Gama was not born with a myth around him. He was a man of precision rather than poetry, reserved, strict, and deliberate. He hailed from a seafaring family, but lacked the flamboyance of explorers more celebrated in storybooks. His strength lay in his focus, in a kind of disciplined stubbornness that would prove essential. Chosen by King Manuel I himself, da Gama was tasked with a mission that was equal parts, wholly political and commercial, to find a direct sea route to India, to the land of spices and silks of knowledge and myth. This was no romantic endeavor. The sea route to India was not just a curiosity, it was a geopolitical ambition. The overland Silk Road was long and contested, controlled by rivals and intermediaries. The seas, though treacherous, offered Portugal the promise of exclusive access to eastern riches and the opportunity to bypass Muslim-controlled trade routes. Backed by the Pope's approval, the expedition also held a missionary zeal, cloaked in sails and gunpowder. To reach India was to reach not only profit, but salvation, or so they believed. 4 ships formed the fleet, the Snow Gabriel da Gama's own. The Snow Raphael, commanded by his brother Paulo, a smaller caravel, and a storage ship heavy with provisions and cargo. Their crews numbered around 170 men, from seasoned sailors to carpenters, interpreters, priests, and prisoners. They carried everything from trade goods and gold to texts and trumpets. Every crate held some hope of barter, of blessing, of surviving long enough to return. In the beginning, their pace was cautious. They stayed close to the coast of Africa, stopping at known ports and unfamiliar shores. The wind was both guide and enemy. Repairs were frequent. Crew morale fluctuated. The further they sailed, the stranger the stars became and the less certain the maps. Supplies began to spoil, rations thinned. It was during this slow, tense crawl down the coast that Da Gama chose to veer far west into open sea, a daring gamble to bypass the windless Gulf of Guinea. Weeks passed, then months, no land, only water. The horizon held nothing. The heat grew oppressive. Food rotted, water staled, bodies weakened. Diseases began to whisper through the crew. Scurvy, the slow thief of strength, began its quiet work. Men grew gaunt, joints ached, gums bled. There were arguments, accusations, even despair, but Da Gama held the course. Cold, calculating, determined. When at last they sighted land rounding the storm-lashed Cape of Good Hope, it was a moment of cautious relief. The Atlantic was behind them, but the journey was far from over. Moving up the eastern coast of Africa, they encountered port cities with established Muslim networks, thriving economies, and political complexities. In Mozambique, the Portuguese claimed to be Muslims themselves, an attempt to blend in, to gather information. It worked briefly. Then it unraveled. Suspicion arose. Local leaders questioned their origin, their intentions, their accents. Tensions tightened like coiled rope. There were threats. The Portuguese took hostages. Cannon fire followed. They left quickly under duress. Further north in Mombasa, hostility deepened. The welcome was colder. Their every move was watched. Spies slipped among them, feeding misinformation. Navigators given to them steered them deliberately astray. It became clear they were not simply visitors, they were potential disruptors, unknown elements in a carefully balanced world. In Malindi, however, fortunes shifted. The local ruler, less aligned with Mombasa, offered cautious friendship. Most importantly, he provided a pilot likely an Indian Muslim well-versed in monsoon patterns in the open ocean. His knowledge was critical. Without him, they would not have crossed the Indian Ocean. The crossing to India was a final, grueling test. The ships strained. The crews suffered. Supplies again dwindled. Da Gama himself became ill, but the pilot's guidance held true. Winds caught their sails. Stars marked their progress. And after nearly 11 months at sea, they sighted the shores of Calicut on the Malabar coast of India. Try to imagine that first moment. Palm trees rising gently above distant beaches. The air dense with unfamiliar scents: cinnamon, cloves, sandalwood. Boats painted in bright colors gliding between harbor and shore. The cacophony of trade, of voices and languages unknown. They had arrived. They had done what no European fleet had ever accomplished. They had reached India by sea. But arrival did not bring triumph. The court of the Zamorin, ruler of Calicut, received Da Gama and his crew with polite skepticism. The gifts presented cloaks, hats, copperware were unimpressive to a society accustomed to the riches of Arabia, China, and Java. The Portuguese seemed crude, their offerings provincial. Tensions simmered beneath each conversation. Negotiations soured. Trade proved elusive. The Portuguese resorted to strategies they understood: intimidation, displays of firepower, ultimatums. The illusion of diplomacy frayed. In the end, they departed with few goods, fewer allies, and a heavy burden of pride. The return voyage was worse. Storms battered the ships. Many perished. Some vessels were lost. Da Gama returned to Portugal in 1499, gaunt and aged, bringing with him only 55 surviving crewmen. And yet, he returned. And that was enough. The voyage proved that the sea path existed. It could be sailed. It could be survived. Trade would follow. Then empire, then war. But those are stories for later. For now, let your breath settle. Let your mind drift across the ocean, heavy with memory and silence. The sea is vast. But history, like the tide, always returns. Imagine the silence of the seabed. A silence not of emptiness, but of memory. Off the coast of Mozambique, beneath warm waters that shimmer in the tropical sun, lie the bones of ships once bound for glory. Carracks and caravels, splintered and eroded by time, rest among coral reefs and sandbanks. The water moves gently through what remains twisted iron, barnacle-covered cannons, crates never delivered, rusted anchors, and sometimes fragments of human ambition. This is not just a graveyard, it is a museum sculpted by currents. This stretch of coastline, particularly near Mozambique Island and the ancient port of Sofala, became a critical artery for the Portuguese Empire's Indian Ocean ambitions. It was here that their fleets paused for repair, for fresh water and rest, and sometimes to falter and fail entirely. The treacherous coral reefs, sudden monsoon-driven storms, and unpredictable tides turned many proud vessels into relics long before they could reach their destinations in Goa, Calicut, or back home to Lisbon. But what the sea claimed, it often preserved cradled in salt, shrouded in coral, suspended in time. The earliest wrecks date from the early 1500s, as Portuguese expansion brought a steady flow of ships laden with spices, ivory, silk, missionaries, iron cannons, and bullion across the Indian Ocean and down the Swahili coast. These vessels, often overloaded and top-heavy, were not sleek or agile. They were floating fortresses, heavy, lumbering, and riddled with creeks. Their sails sagged in heavy wind. Their rudders were ill-suited to sharp coastal currents. Captained by men who believed they had mastered these oceans, they often underestimated the sea's vast and changing nature. One of the most tragic wrecks was that of the Snow Joe, which met its end in 1552 near the present-day shores of KwaZulu-Natal, south of Mozambique. Caught in a fierce storm and dashed against the coast, its hull shattered like dry bark. Over 500 passengers and crew found themselves marooned in a land they had never seen, surrounded by towering forest and unfamiliar peoples. Among the survivors were noblewomen, infants, enslaved workers, and clerics. With no clear rescue, they began a harrowing journey northward on foot, hoping to reach friendly Portuguese outposts. They wandered for months through jungle, across rivers and dunes, enduring hunger, disease, and raids. Few survived the ordeal. Their suffering was later recorded not just in logs, but in legend. Further north, the shipwreck of the Santo Antonio de Tana lies near Mozambique Island, once a vibrant trading post and fortress. This ship carried textiles from Gujarat, Chinese porcelain, spices, incense, and silver currency in locked chests. It sank during a frantic attempt to unload cargo quickly during a brewing storm. A rogue wave smashed it against the coral shelf, cracking its belly open. Some cargo was saved. Much of it remains entombed beneath coral. Over the years, divers have found spoons with royal crests, beads of Venetian glass, shards of broken ceramics glazed with sea salt, and bronze bells silenced by the deep. Divers and underwater archaeologists exploring these wrecks find more than gold or treasure. They uncover fragments of lives. Crosses etched onto cannonballs. Navigational tools rusted into stillness. Rosaries half buried in silt. Leather boots hardened by time. These were ships of war and prayer, of commerce and hope. They carried lives, letters, intentions. Every artifact is a whisper from the past, saying, "We were here. We tried." There is something deeply meditative in the thought of these vessels, once symbols of divine, right and imperial ambition now crumbled on the ocean floor, visited only by fish and the occasional curious human. The sea, indifferent to flags or faith, offered no favoritism. It reminded the Portuguese and us that no mastery of chart or compass can outmatch nature's quiet command. Local communities along the coast, from ancient Swahili towns to modern villages, have long known of these wrecks. Oral traditions speak of iron monsters from the sea, of wood that burned differently, of strange objects that washed ashore. In some places, timbers from wrecks were used to build homes. Brass tools were repurposed into fishing gear. Even words entered the language, borrowed from Portuguese. Influence did not only come through fortresses or catechisms, it came washed up on beaches. Mozambique's coast today remains a place of mystery and opportunity for scholars and divers alike. Many shipwrecks remain undiscovered, buried beneath layers of sand, or mistaken for reefs. Occasionally, cyclones stir the seabed and reveal the skeletons of long-forgotten voyages. Research expeditions, both Mozambican and international, use sonar, remote drones, and patient hand-digging to study these watery tombs. Some dives reveal only fish bones and shells. Others uncover centuries-old astrolabes, medallions, even handwritten pages, ink still legible in the brine. But these aren't simply tales of maritime disaster. They are rich, layered stories of human connection where global trade, religious fervor, local resistance, and tragic misjudgment all meet in the same surf. In their watery resting places, these wrecks speak more honestly than many chronicles penned in royal courts. They reveal not only the ambitions of empire, but the limits of power, the resilience of coastal communities, and the unpredictable rhythm of the sea. So if you close your eyes now and imagine the waves lapping at the coral-fringed coast of Mozambique, try to hear more than just the breeze. Beneath it lies a deeper hush. The ships are silent, but their stories continue to drift through currents and time, waiting to be heard again. Far from the crashing surf and treacherous reefs of Mozambique, behind the tall stone facades of Lisbon's Ribeira Palace, decisions were made that would alter the fates of nations. This was no ordinary royal dwelling, it was the orchestrating mind of an empire ruled by salt, wind, and divine ambition. A place where polished floors reflected candlelight and every corridor murmured with secrets. Lisbon's maritime palace thrummed with the quiet noise of empire. Imagine yourself within those ornate halls, the floor cool underfoot, smooth with wear, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax polish, melting tallow, aging parchment, and traces of salt from ships freshly docked on the Tagus River. Along long wooden tables, clerks and secretaries unrolled scrolls from India, Africa, and Brazil. Letters from captains, lists of cargo, fragments of broken treaties, ink still damp. Some messages brought news of victory, others of disaster. And yet the palace moved forward, always calculating, always dreaming. It was here that King Manuel I, known to some as the Fortunate, presided over an empire that was still finding its shape. But even a fortunate king must gamble. And sending ships across the world's oceans was the greatest gamble of them all. Each expedition had to be planned with meticulous care, funding secured from wealthy investors, routes negotiated among rivals, captains chosen from both loyalty and skill, and approval sought from the church. Fortunes could be won or lost on a single voyage. And in these halls behind velvet drapes and carved doors, powerful men and women wagered not just gold, but reputation, survival, and souls. The Casa de India, or India House, was the empire's nerve center. Tucked within the palace, this bureaucratic powerhouse managed every facet of overseas trade. It collected cargo, inspected goods, tracked merchant fees, and determined what profits would go to the crown. It even set maritime policy and regulated ship design. But while its offices were filled with ledgers and wax seals, its work echoed far beyond the palace, rippling across oceans, markets, and generations. The court was no stranger to intrigue. Beneath the formalities and prayer, beneath the proclamations and processions, simmered ambition. Merchants from Lisbon, Porto, and beyond vied for influence, offering bribes, favors, and alliances in hopes of gaining exclusive contracts or privileged routes. Nobles, some descended from crusaders, others newly risen through marriage or fortune, competed for governorships in Goa, Brazil, or Angola. There were schemes within schemes. One family's gain was another's ruin. The church, as ever, held a powerful seat at the table. Portugal's overseas expansion was cloaked in spiritual righteousness, justified by papal bulls such as Romanus Pontifex and Ocitera. These documents, written in Latin and signed with sacred seals, declared Portugal the rightful guardian of heathen lands, so long as it baptized them. Missionaries sailed with fleets, planted crosses in newly claimed lands, and sent back reports rich in both zeal and fear. In Lisbon, bishops advised the king, while Dominican and Jesuit priests wrote quiet assessments of court behavior and colonial policy. And behind the tapestries and ceremonial trappings lay a more personal world. Who would lead the next fleet? Whose son would be sent to the dangerous outposts? Which family had gained the king's favor, perhaps through a daughter's marriage, or through a particularly profitable voyage? Rumors spread faster than caravels. A whispered word over a cup of wine could elevate a merchant or condemn a noble to disgrace. Even those who never saw the inside of the palace felt its gravity. Dockworkers hauled spices in silence, watched by agents. Cartographers were pressed to redraw borders as new coasts were discovered. Cannons were forged, maps updated, ships provisioned, all under the unseen pressure of court expectations. In the city's Jewish and New Christian quarters, financiers provided loans for expeditions even as they lived under suspicion and surveillance. The Inquisition loomed, just beyond the palace's gold-leaf chapels. Women, though seldom credited in official records, were present in subtle but powerful ways. Queens and princesses corresponded with viceroys and missionaries, offering counsel or demanding restraint. Noblewomen arranged marriages to secure alliances in far-flung territories. Courtiers' wives hosted salons where strategy and gossip mixed. Nuns in quiet convents copied letters from missionaries and records from the East, preserving knowledge in ink and prayer. And among the gardens that bloomed along the river filled with orange trees and medicinal herbs, one might hear quiet conversations, veiled requests, or even the soft weeping of a noble woman whose son was sent too far. These were spaces where official history met private consequence. Lisbon's Ribeira Palace no longer stands. It fell, along with much of the city, in the devastating earthquake of 1755. But while it stood, it bore witness to a unique moment in history, a convergence of faith, greed, fear, intellect, and determination. Its rooms hosted the people who mapped the oceans not only with ink and compass, but with human ambition. If you find yourself walking the modern streets near the Tagus, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the scent of parchment and tallow. Hear the low rustle of silk robes and murmured Latin prayers. The palace is gone, but its echoes remain hidden beneath the stone, drifting like sea mists through time. We sail gently into the vast and endless sea, not as explorers chasing glory, but as quiet observers, watching, listening, and imagining what it meant to live one's life upon the waves. Before engines hummed, before navigation screens glowed, there were men and women whose entire existence was shaped by the rhythm of the tide. Fishermen pulling nets before dawn, merchants coaxing cargo through monsoons. Sailors watching the stars in silence. Let your thoughts drift there now. To those salt-stung mornings, to decks slick with brine, to hammocks creaking softly in the dark. In this story, there are no pirates chasing treasure. No cannon blasts or thrilling rescues. Only the quiet beat of daily life, at sea. So settle in. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the sound of history lull you. As we begin our slow descent into a forgotten world upon the waves. Beneath the sails, a day in the life of a sailor. Imagine yourself standing barefoot on the wooden deck of a merchant vessel. It is the early 1600s. The ship is Dutch, though the sea knows no borders. Above you, a square-rigged sail rustles in the morning breeze. Beneath you, planks creak softly with every subtle shift of the tide. The day begins long before the sun. There are no alarms, no clocks, only the soft bark of the boatswain's call, and the clatter of men rising from hammocks in the shadowed lower deck. The air here is thick. Not foul exactly, but heavy with tar, dried fish, sweat, and something earthy from the last port's hold. You stretch. Your body is sore from days of labor, pulling ropes, scrubbing decks, cleaning rigging that sways like reeds in the wind. Your first task is to help raise the sails. The canvas is stiff with salt, and the ropes thick as your wrists bite into calloused palms. You work silently beside your crewmates, each of you moving in practiced rhythm, as though pulled by invisible strings. Above, gulls circle lazily. The sky is a soft gray, smeared with streaks of pink. The sea is calm today. Not glassy, but gentle, it swell a slow, steady breath beneath the ship's hull. Breakfast is simple, hardtack and salted pork. The biscuit crumbles in your mouth like chalk, and you drink weak beer, not for pleasure, but because the water in barrels has long since turned. Conversation is sparse. There's no need for it. You know these men, their habits, their silences. A nod, a grunt, a glance at the wind's direction is enough. Hours pass. You patch sails, you mend rope. You scrape barnacles from the ship's belly during the midday lull. Your shirt sticks to your skin. The sun, when it comes, is merciless. But the sea offers no shade. Sometimes you pass other ships. A wave of the hand. A shouted greeting if the weather allows. And then they disappear again, swallowed by distance. When the work is done, you rest in the little time allowed. You lean against the railing. You watch flying fish skim the surface like skipping stones. You count clouds, you think of home, but the sea has no clocks. Only watches shifts of labor marked by the changing sky, and the slow swing of a brass bell that echoes faintly through the mist. Night falls with little ceremony. A red sky, a final meal, a final knot tied, then darkness, except for stars. So many stars, more than you ever saw on land. So bright they seem to hum. Below deck, hammocks sway. Rats scurry between crates. A shipmate snores quietly. The rhythm of their lives continues. A cycle of work, of waiting, of wandering across water. And in this moment you sleep. To the gentle creak of wood, to the distant sigh of waves against the hull. A sailor, not a hero, not a villain, but simply a soul at sea. Matthew Flinders, the quiet cartographer of the Southern Sea. Now, imagine another figure, not a deckhand, but a man with a journal always tucked beneath his coat, its pages filled with notes, with careful sketches of coastlines, with the gentle, persistent observations of a man who preferred precision to fame. This is Matthew Flinders. His name is not as loud in history as Magellan or Columbus, but his legacy is etched into every map of the continent we now call Australia. Not with conquest, but with quiet persistence. Not with glory, but with patience and salt. Flinders was born in 1774 in Lincolnshire, England. He was not destined for the sea by blood. His family were surgeons and farmers, but something in him longed for distant shores. As a boy, he read Robinson Crusoe, and something in that tale, its loneliness, its longing, called to him. By 16, he was at sea. Not in command, but learning, observing. He served aboard ships in the Royal Navy, first in battles, but quickly his talent for navigation stood out. What made Flinders different was not boldness, but curiosity. He wanted to know what was there, not what could be taken. He saw the coast of Terra Australis, that vast, barely charted southern land, not as mystery, but as a puzzle to be solved through time, wind, and ink. In 1801, he set sail aboard H. Hem's Investigator. His mission, to circumnavigate and map the entire coastline of Australia. It had never been done before, not fully, not with the detail he intended. The voyage took 3 years. 3 years of wind-burnt mornings, of sketching unfamiliar shores through squinted eyes. 3 years of scurvy, of failing supplies, of crewmen growing thin and gray under tropical suns. The ship creaked constantly. The copper sheathing beneath the hull slowly peeled away. Fresh water ran low, and still Flinders persisted. He was not one to shout or to threaten. Instead, he led by steadiness. He kept records. He named bays and capes with quiet logic. He sailed around the southern point, now called Cape Lovin, through stormy waters where waves rose like cliffs, and into the still, strange beauty of the Gulf of Carpentaria. But the sea is rarely kind for long. The Investigator was falling apart. Its timbers groaned with every wave. The ship, no longer seaworthy, limped ashore in Timor and then made its way back to England without him. For on the return journey, Flinders stopped in Mauritius, then a French colony. Though he carried peaceful charts, the Napoleonic Wars were raging. He was seen as a threat. He was detained. And for over 6 years, he was held under house arrest. Not as a prisoner in chains, but as a voyager caged. His charts sat unfinished. His ship had sailed without him. And still he worked. He refined his maps. He wrote his journal. He clung to a calm certainty that one day his work would speak louder than war. Eventually he was released. He returned to England, weakened in body, but not in purpose. He compiled his work into a book, A Voyage to Terra Australis. He died the very day the book was published. It had taken him decades, and he saw its cover only hours before his passing. Today, the shape of Australia, we know its outline, its bays, its great curves and corners, owes much to Matthew Flinders. But he did not name it, not officially. Though he was among the first to use the term Australia, it would be years before it was adopted. Still, the continent carries his touch. There is no grand statue, no towering monument to him. Only coastlines, quietly accurate. a man who looked at the sea and saw a map waiting to be drawn. He remains like many who worked the waves, a quiet presence, patient, precise, persistent. And now his memory drifts quietly through time, like the ships he once steered through the soft blue haze of the Southern Sea. Matthew Flinders, the quiet cartographer of the Southern Sea. Now, imagine another figure, not a deckhand, but a man with a journal always tucked beneath his coat. Its pages filled with notes, with careful sketches of coastlines, with the gentle, persistent observations of a man who preferred precision to fame. This is Matthew Flinders. His name is not as loud in history as Magellan or Columbus, but his legacy is etched into every map of the continent we now call Australia. Not with conquest, but with quiet persistence. Not with glory, but with patience and salt. Flinders was born in 1774 in Lincolnshire, England. He was not destined for the sea by blood. His family were surgeons and farmers. But something in him longed for distant shores. As a boy, he read Robinson Crusoe, and something in that tale, its loneliness, its longing called to him. By 16, he was at sea. Not in command, but learning. Observing. He served aboard ships in the Royal Navy, first in battles, but quickly his talent for navigation stood out. What made Flinders different was not boldness, but curiosity. He wanted to know what was there and not what could be taken. He saw the coast of Terra Australis, that vast, barely charted southern land, not as mystery, but as a puzzle to be solved through time, wind, and ink. In 1801, he set sail aboard H. Hem's Investigator. His mission, to circumnavigate and map the entire coastline of Australia. It had never been done before. Not fully. Not with the detail he intended. The voyage took 3 years. 3 years of wind-burnt mornings, of sketching unfamiliar shores through squinted eyes. 3 years of scurvy, of failing supplies, of crewmen growing thin and gray under tropical suns. The ship creaked constantly. The copper sheathing beneath the hull slowly peeled away. Freshwater ran low. And still, Flinders persisted. He was not one to shout or to threaten. Instead, he led by steadiness. He kept records. He named bays and capes with quiet logic. He sailed around the southern point now called Cape Leeuwin, through stormy waters where waves rose like cliffs, and into the still, strange beauty of the Gulf of Carpentaria. But the sea is rarely kind for long. The Investigator was falling apart. Its timbers groaned with every wave. The ship, no longer seaworthy, limped ashore in Timor and then made its way back to England without him. For on the return journey, Flinders stopped in Mauritius, then a French colony. Though he carried peaceful charts, the Napoleonic Wars were raging. He was seen as a threat. He was detained. And for over 6 years, he was held under house arrest. Not as a prisoner in chains, but as a voyager caged. His charts sat unfinished. His ship had sailed without him. And still he worked. He refined his maps. He wrote his journal. He clung to a calm certainty that one day his work would speak louder than war. Eventually he was released. He returned to England. Weakened in body, but not in purpose. He compiled his work into a book, A Voyage to Terra Australis. He died the very day the book was published. It had taken him decades, and he saw its cover only hours before his passing. Today, the shape of Australia we know, its outline, its bays, its great curves and corners, owes much to Matthew Flinders. But he did not name it, not officially. Though he was among the first to use the term Australia, it would be years before it was adopted. Still, the continent carries his touch. There's no grand statue, no towering monument to him. Only coastlines, quietly accurate. A man who looked at the sea and saw a map waiting to be drawn. He remains, like many who worked the waves, a quiet presence, patient, precise, persistent. And now, his memory drifts quietly through time, like the ships he once steered through the soft blue haze of the Southern Sea. The vanishing ships, ghost vessels and lost sailors of the sea. Now we drift into murkier waters. Not darker, but quieter. Still, here history whispers through broken hulls rusting beneath the waves, and through legends carried from port to port, always changing, never quite landing. Across centuries, countless ships have set sail and never returned. No wreckage, no survivors, only questions. The sea does not always give back its secrets, but it leaves behind echoes in sailors' tailies and ancient maps marked with curling warnings, and in strange finds pulled from the ocean floor. Let us begin in the icy channels of the Canadian Arctic, where in 1845, two British ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set out under the command of Sir John Franklin. Their mission was bold: to find and chart the fabled Northwest Passage, a navigable route through the Arctic ice, linking the Atlantic to the Pacific. They were never seen again. For over 150 years, the fate of the Franklin expedition was a mystery. What happened to the 129 men aboard? Why were no survivors found? Search expeditions scoured the ice. They found traces: cans of food sealed with lid, notes tucked into stone cairns, a boat abandoned in the middle of the tundra, containing human remains and silver spoons. There were stories, too, told by the Inuit who lived near those frozen shores. They spoke of pale men walking across the ice, desperate and slow, of camps built from ship timbers, of starvation. The ships themselves remained hidden beneath the Arctic ice until the 21st century. In 2014 and 2016, they were found resting quietly on the seafloor, preserved by the cold. Cabins intact, plates still stacked on shelves, blankets folded, as though waiting. The sea had kept them, tucked away from time. And there are others. Ships lost not to ice, but to warm waters. Like the Flor de la Mar, a Portuguese galleon that vanished off the coast of Sumatra in 1511. It was laden with gold, jewels, and spoils from the conquest of Malacca. A storm took her. She broke apart on hidden reefs. No trace of the treasure has ever been found, though the legend lives on, growing with each retelling. Or consider the haunting remains of the Mary Celeste, found adrift in the Atlantic in 1872. She was perfectly seaworthy, her cargo untouched. Meals half-eaten, the crew gone. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no damage to the ship, only silence, like a breath held. A presence missing. Speculation abounded. Pirates? Mutiny? A rogue wave? But no answer ever settled the question. And perhaps that is the sea's way to preserve the unknown, to soften truth into legend. Even ancient cultures treated the sea as a border between worlds. To the Greeks, the ocean was the realm of Poseidon, a god not cruel, but unpredictable. To the Polynesians, it was a path, a road of stars, navigated not by maps, but by wind, wave, and memory. They read swells like language. They knew by the shape of clouds and the way birds flew how far they were from land. Their canoes, lashed with coconut fiber, crossed thousands of kilometers of open water, not randomly, not recklessly, but with deep, practiced knowledge passed from voice to voice. The sea for them was not mystery, but kin, alive, listened to. And still, even today, we find evidence of lost vessels, and coral-covered anchors, and coins washed ashore, in sonar pings that suggest a shape beneath the sand. Each discovery is a story interrupted, a voyage paused mid-sentence. And so we sail on, past the vanished, the unspoken, the mapped and the unmapped. In the end, the sea does not explain. It only holds. From galleys to gilded cabins, the divided worlds aboard a ship, let us now turn our gaze from the depths below to the quiet inequalities aboard. Not all who sailed the sea lived the same story. Some scrubbed decks and slept in swaying hammocks. Others dined on porcelain beneath velvet-draped lanterns. Even on the same vessel, two entirely different worlds could float side by side, one above deck, bathed in command and privilege, and one below, drenched in sweat, labor, and salt. Let us begin with the ships of the 18th century, vessels of empire, trade, and war. At the very top of the chain, you'd find the captain. His cabin was at the stern, large by ship standards, lined with books, charts, instruments. His meals were cooked separately, often with preserved delicacies, wine, fruits, and brandy, biscuits stored in locked chests. The officers, too, had their privileges. They ate at tables with linen cloths, had access to tobacco, and sometimes even fresh clothes from their own private trunks. Contrast this with the ordinary seaman, a man whose diet consisted of salt pork, hardtack, and beer, whose only refuge was a hammock slung in a dark, crowded hold, whose name was often not recorded in the ship's log, only his role. The rhythm of their lives was unending labor, bracing the mast, heaving ropes, scraping the deck inch by inch. Punishment was swift for disobedience. A lash, a loss of pay, or worse, being put ashore on some distant, unknown coast. The social divide was not limited to European ships. On Chinese treasure junks under Admiral Zheng He, hierarchy was equally strict. Zheng He himself, a Muslim eunuch at the Ming court, commanded fleets larger than anything Europe would see for another century. His ships were floating cities. On board were scholars, scribes, soldiers, and sailors. Each had their own quarters, their own food, even their own language in some cases. The officers, often scholars appointed by the imperial court, were housed near the center of the ship, a place of balance and safety. The rowers and mariners lived at the edge, by the noise, by the wet, and there were other divides more subtle. Consider the women who sailed not by choice, but by status, wives of wealthy merchants, noblewomen traveling between courts, or captains' spouses on long voyages. They often had private quarters partitioned off by canvas or wood, a rare space of softness in the hard world of sailing. But even within privilege, isolation reigned. A woman aboard was rare, sometimes unwelcome. Her world was quiet, bounded by the waves and by watchful eyes. In the age of empire, merchant ships carried even deeper divides. Some passengers boarded in fine linen and lace, bound for new colonies with silver hairbrushes tucked into their trunks. They spent their days reading or walking the quarterdeck, careful not to dirty their shoes. Others were chained. Indentured laborers. Enslaved peoples, packed into holds without light or air. Their journey, not a passage, was a place of order, but also a mirror of the world it came from. Class, power, privilege all floated there, stacked deck by deck. And still, in the midst of these divides, there were moments of closeness. Storms did not respect rank. When sails tore in violent wind, even the captain had to brace himself. When food spoiled or water ran low, hunger leveled all. Music, too, sometimes softened the divide. A fiddler might play in the evenings. Songs rose up from the lower decks, sailors' tunes, homesick lullabies. The officers above could hear them. And for a moment, the ship became one voice. And so, as the vessel rocked gently under moonlight, each person aboard, rich or poor, listened to the same sea. They saw the same stars. They dreamt of different homes, but all in the same direction. The ocean did not care for gold or station. Its waves touched every hull the same.